I'm Father Cajetan Cuddy, the General Editor of the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, ECT, with my colleague, Dr. Matthew Minard, who's the Managing Editor of the ECT. And in this video, we're going to discuss one of the entries from the ECT Lexicon. Lexicons are like dictionaries, and they provide short, concise descriptions that define what something is. And today, we're excited to discuss with you the word motion. And on ect.org, we have this definition. Motion, the actualization of something in potency insofar as it is in potency. Motion, or kinesis, is the process by which a subject passes from a given state of privation toward a given terminus or end, in which that subject will have the new form in question. Classically, motions can be of various kinds: local motion regarding place, quantitative increase, and qualitative alteration. More broadly speaking, one can speak of motion towards the gain or loss of a substantial form, as a kind of motion towards corruption or generation, although corruption and generation themselves are not motions. This word, just by way of preface, dear friends, is one of the most important words in all of the lexicon entries. And the reason for that, for those of us who, even if we're not philosophers and we just want to understand the faith better, motion here, as it was indicated in the lexicon, even if a little technically, is the simple fact that motion in this sense, the precise sense, does not just mean a change of place. It bespeaks changes of a variety of sorts. And why is this important for salvation and for Catholic theology? It's because Jesus changes us. We are changed. We undergo a motion in the process of salvation. And so now we have Dr. Matthew Minard, whom is a philosopher of standing and insight, and I can already feel it, even through the pixels of the screen, that this is a topic that you have much passion about. Dr. Minard, take us away, lead us off.
Isn't it surprising that something like motion is something that could arouse like such passion? I can feel in that entry too. I'm like, oh, I'm sure that was something I added as a subdivision. Like, just nothing at all wrong with what we received from our collaborators who helped us. But I wanted to make all those cut reality at all those joints. Partially because, first and foremost, in this sublunary sphere, so to speak, but in all of material reality, motion is the actualization that's most, sort of, so to speak, connatural to the material world. It's only in the case of man that you have at least the possibility of act in the fullest and most, in a sense, proper sense that can be pulled back from motion a bit. Now, it's true that form and et cetera is energeia, or act, in a way that's not motion. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. See, this is philosophy. It's like 8,000 qualifications. But motion is the actualization that we experience most frequently, at least. And it's technically also, it's the highway for good metaphysicians, the highway to metaphysics, it's highway to God. The philosophy of nature basically studies being, which somewhere out there in space you'll find a lexicon video about being. Motion is the sort of being, mobile being, that we first kind of travel down, that we first investigate in order to understand what it is to be. And it's really important, like you said, that there's a bias in our mind, really, that's hard for people to overcome, to think of motion as though it's local displacement, which is a kind of motion. Local displacement is a kind of motion, but it's because we're so used to thinking in terms of reductionist science that would reduce everything to sort of, even though we've gotten beyond this technically in physics, everyone still kind of has this in their imagination, I think, matter and motion. It's just an atomism in our mind that's so natural. But motion takes place anytime that you have a process where something was not one thing and is not yet the other thing, but is on the way to being that. And it's that actuality right there is what motion is. However it happens, like we said, by quantitative extension. So this is not just a question of people getting fatter. It's even the growth of a crystal, so to speak, or describing merely the growth in quantity in a living being. But living beings also have a kind of coordination of parts, and so they grow qualitatively in their substance. And this can also technically apply to as we grow in virtue, we grow in a given ability. And so, I could use one of two examples. I mean, my kids are taking piano, or we could think of even, something like doing the work of carpentry. There's a sense in which I do not have the art of carpentry, but sort of over the course of multiple projects, I've worked to have the habit of carpentry, and it's very different than the person who has it, right? An expert carpenter, like when I talk to an expert carpenter, they can just sort of look at a space and they just see the possibilities of what should be done and must be done and how to coordinate the pieces of activity and all the workers, like sort of all at once to do it. Whereas that process, like practicing the piano, is I'm trying to gain the form of being a carpenter or being a pianist of some sort, or to have a virtue, in the motion toward having the state of soul. Which, in the case of music, because it's easier to see things like arts because they're closer to our activity, they're closer to our experience because they involve our doing, our activity. When you're practicing and working to be a musician, it's very different than the person who just improvs, right? I'm sure you've been at a liturgy. This is an example I always use, where your organist perhaps takes the antiphon for the day in the Roman Rite and just all of a sudden improvs over like the incensing of your altar at the beginning or something like that, right? In that case, there's just deployment going on. I mean, there's a kind of motion that's still involved, but that's real act. But motion is all around, and each little piece of that definition, which is very Aristotelian in its origin, is important, right? It's the act of something that is in potency, so it's a kind of actualization, but it's in as much as that is still in potency. So it's not just like the musician who's in the groove. That's in a sense transcending motion, interestingly enough, even though it has the movement of fingers and stuff going on. And yeah, this is super important. And like you said, this is really important just in the structure of our knowing in a very rigorous way, philosophy, because it's by the analysis of the kind of being of motion, the being of mobile being, that we are able to attune our mind to eventually talk about being, whatever the word being means, which would then be the science of metaphysics. Sorry, Eric, I could just go on and on about motion of all things. Like, people are like, why is the madman talking? So, yeah.
No, I'm trying to resist the urge to just be nodding continually. Yeah. I agree with everything, of course, that you say. And I'm just thinking, like, to phrase it in a way that that hits home even for the very non-philosophically acute in our viewership. We are contingent beings. We exist and we change. That dynamic of change and our identity as motional, changing beings. And motion implies both continuity and discontinuity. Something is the same, something is different. So that's what we are. We're not always the same, but we're not in every way different. And this is when you have the God of all reality who does not change. He does not suffer motion because he's pure act. His essence and his existence are identical. What does he do? Pure act comes down and activates us, in the case of salvation, supernaturally, so that there is both continuity and discontinuity. I always say to my students, Dr. Minard, that without motion, there's no salvation. Because in order for me to be saved, it needs to be me. But in order for me to be saved, I need to be different, to be changed, to be moved from what I am. And so this is at the heart of the Christian religion. And Dr. Minard, what he says is, even if it sounds abstract, it's only abstract because it's literally applicable to everything that exists in the world of contingency.
And the only thing I would say is, remember that the motion toward conversion is more like a preliminary set of dispositions for a substantial change.
Absolutely.
This is how that applies theologically. That's my nerdery at the end, but I agree. Well summarized. I just had to get a nerd stamp on the end, but no, well said.
Absolutely.
Well said. So,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so this is the kind of thing we look forward to having, hopefully some articles on philosophy of nature. And so people who are interested, of course, can then consider, reading there if they so desire. Or they can flip over to other videos that have more relevance in maybe in their mind, but then they'll find out someday that motion is the path that we walk, because it's the experience of contingent beings. It's what we experience, because it's the actualization that's happening all around us all the time.
Amen.